A widower with 2 daughters was walking down the street when he saw a woman identical to his late wife with his youngest daughter in a luxury restaurant. As he approached, he broke down in tears after hearing what his daughter said. The house breathed silence and longing. David adjusted the plates on the worn wooden table, his slow and calculated movements revealing the weight of someone who had learned to be both father and mother at the same time. At 40, his dark hair already carried silver strands at the temples, and his calloused hands told stories of hard work and sleepless nights. The night wind came through the half-open window, swaying the faded curtains and making the flames of the candles that illuminated the simple dinner dance. "Girls, come to dinner," he called in a hoarse voice, trying to sound cheerful despite the fatigue that weighed on his shoulders. Madison appeared first at the doorway, her 12 years carrying a seriousness that shouldn't exist in someone so young. Her brown hair was tied in a simple ponytail, and her dark eyes observed everything around her with the attention of someone who had assumed responsibilities beyond her age. She wore a navy blue dress that Sarah had sewn months before leaving, and every stitch of that garment seemed to scream her mother's absence. She held her younger sister's hand with maternal protection, guiding her to the chair. "Emma, sit here next to Daddy," she said tenderly. "He prepared your favorite food today." Little Emma, with her 7 years and golden curls that resembled her mother's so much, smiled shyly as she settled into the chair. Her green eyes shone with that pure innocence that had not yet been completely touched by the pain of loss, although a subtle sadness always danced in her gaze when no one was watching. She wore a pink dress with small embroidered flowers, another gift from Sarah's skillful hands, and swung her short legs that didn't reach the floor. "Daddy, Mummy used to sit in this chair, didn't she?" she asked, pointing to the empty chair beside David. "Sometimes I feel like she's still here with us, watching us have dinner." David swallowed hard, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that always came when his daughters mentioned Sarah. His eyes filled with held-back tears as he served the steaming stew onto the plates, trying to keep his hands steady despite the tremor that insisted on appearing. The table, which was once the stage for lively conversations and laughter, now echoed only careful whispers and heavy silences. The pictures on the walls showed happy moments of a complete family, but now they seemed like ghosts of a past that would never return. "She is here with us, my love," he replied with a choked voice. "She will always be in our hearts and in every moment we spend together." During dinner, Emma played with her food, making small piles with the stew while observing her father with childlike curiosity. Madison ate in silence, her eyes attentive to David's every expression, as if it were her responsibility to ensure he didn't crumble in front of them. The wind continued to whisper through the window, bringing with it the perfume of the garden flowers that Sarah had loved to tend, a scent that still permeated the house and made her absence even more palpable. The candles flickered, creating dancing shadows on the walls, and giving the scene a melancholic tone that mirrored the family's state of mind. "Daddy, can I ask a question?" said Emma with her sweet and curious voice. "Why did Mommy write so many letters before she went away?" Emma's question made David stop chewing, his fork freezing in the air as he processed his daughter's words. Madison also looked up, her expression revealing that she too had wondered the same thing many times. Sarah's letters were kept in a wooden box in the bedroom, each marked with different dates and some with specific instructions about when they should be opened. David knew that Sarah had spent her last weeks writing those messages, but he had never found the courage to read all of them. "Your mother was very wise, little one," he replied, carefully choosing his words. "She wanted to make sure we would always have her words with us, even when she could no longer speak." Emma was animated by the answer, her eyes shining with a sudden idea that made her face light up like a spring morning. She got up from her chair with enthusiasm, almost knocking over the water glass in the process, and ran to David with outstretched arms. Her small steps echoed across the wooden floor of the simple house, and her pink dress flew around her skinny legs like the petals of a flower being carried by the wind. When she reached her father's side, she held his arm with her 2 delicate little hands and looked at him with that pleading expression that only children can perfect. "So can we read one of Mommy's letters now?" she asked in a melodious voice. "Please, Daddy. I miss her voice telling stories before bedtime so much." David felt his heart tighten even more, but he couldn't resist his younger daughter's request. Madison also approached, her eyes revealing that despite the maturity forced by circumstances, she too yearned for any connection with their lost mother. The 3 candles on the table continued burning, their flames dancing like small spirits, trying to bring Sarah back to the home she had left. The entire house seemed to sigh with expectation, as if the walls themselves were waiting to hear again the loving voice that once filled each room with life and joy. "All right," David agreed, his voice low and full of emotion. "We'll get one of Mom's letters, but you need to promise you'll be okay no matter what she wrote." The 3 walked together to the master bedroom, their steps echoing through the dark corridors of the house that still carried Sarah's subtle perfume in every corner. David turned on the lamp beside the bed, revealing the simple but cozy room that he and Sarah had shared for so many happy years. The bed was impeccably made, as if Sarah might return at any moment to lie down and rest after a long day caring for her family. On the old wooden dresser, photographs in frames showed precious moments: their wedding, the birth of the girls, simple but love-filled vacations. David carefully opened the bottom drawer and removed a carved wooden box, his hands trembling slightly as he ran his fingers over the initials engraved on the lid. "This box holds pieces of Mom's heart," he murmured, looking at his daughters. "Each letter inside is a hug she left for us." Sitting on the edge of the bed, David opened the box, revealing dozens of carefully organized envelopes, each with Sarah's delicate handwriting. Some letters had future dates, others were marked with special occasions like birthdays or graduations, and there were those without specific dates, as if they were spontaneous thoughts Sarah wanted to preserve. Madison observed each envelope with reverence, as if looking at sacred relics, while Emma stretched her neck trying to better see the treasures hidden in the box. The wind outside had intensified, making the curtains sway more vigorously and creating a melancholic symphony that served as the perfect soundtrack for that intimate moment. David chose an envelope simply marked, "For my family when you miss me," and held it with all the care in the world. "This one seems perfect for today," he said with a choked voice. "Let's hear what Mom has to tell us." With trembling fingers, David opened the envelope and unfolded the letter, revealing Sarah's familiar handwriting that immediately brought her voice back to memory. Madison cuddled up on one side and Emma on the other, forming a small circle of love and longing on the bed that still held the subtle scent of Sarah's perfume. The soft light from the lamp created an intimate and welcoming atmosphere, as if Sarah were really present at that moment, whispering her words across the distance that death had created. David began to read in a low emotional voice, each word echoing through the room like a prayer. "My loves, if you are reading this letter, it's because my heart is missing the warmth of our home," he read slowly. "I want you to know that, even from far away, I continue to care for you in a way that you still cannot understand." Sarah's words flowed like honey through David's voice, each phrase carrying maternal love and wisdom that transcended death itself. Emma closed her eyes, absorbing each word as if it were an invisible hug from her mother, while Madison firmly held her father's hand, offering silent support as he fought against tears. The letter continued with advice about being strong in difficult moments, about the importance of caring for each other, and about finding joy in life's small things, even when sadness seemed overwhelming. David felt as if Sarah were really speaking to them through her carefully chosen words, each comma and period a breath from the woman he had loved more than life itself. "Madison, my strong daughter, take care of your father when he forgets to take care of himself," he continued reading, his voice becoming more choked. "And Emma, my little light, never lose that sweetness that makes the world more beautiful." But then, as David continued reading, his eyebrows furrowed and his voice began to falter in a different way. The letter took on a more mysterious tone, with Sarah mentioning things he couldn't fully comprehend. The words spoke of secrets kept out of love, about truths that needed to wait for the right moment to be revealed, and about people who remained hidden to protect those they loved. David felt a chill down his spine when he read the line that said that not everything about the family was as it seemed, and that the future would reveal mysteries that could change everything they thought they knew about themselves. "There is something I need to tell you, but it's not the right time yet," he read with an increasingly tense voice. "There is a secret that could only be revealed in the future, when you are ready to understand the complete truth about our family. The atmosphere in the room changed drastically, as if a dark cloud had passed over the moon outside. David stopped reading abruptly, his hands trembling as he held the letter, as if it might explode at any moment. Madison and Emma watched him with confusion and concern, noticing the sudden change in their father's behavior that had gone from melancholy to something close to panic. The wind outside seemed to be whispering secrets of its own, and the shadows in the room danced more sinisterly, as if they were trying to hide truths that shouldn't be discovered. David quickly folded the letter and put it back in the envelope, his movements brusque and nervous in contrast to the delicacy with which he had handled the paper moments before. "I think we've read enough for today," he said with a forcibly calm voice. "Mom always knew how to choose the right words, but some things are difficult to understand when we're sad." Emma protested with her childish voice, her green eyes shining with unsatisfied curiosity as she tried to understand why her father had stopped reading so suddenly. Madison, with her sensitivity sharpened by premature responsibility, realized that something deeper was happening, something that her father wasn't prepared to share with them at that moment. The entire house seemed to have gone quieter, as if even the walls were keeping the secrets mentioned in Sarah's letter. David put the box back in the drawer with still trembling hands, trying to hide from his daughters the whirlwind of thoughts and fears that Sarah's words had awakened in his mind. "Daddy, why did you stop?" Emma asked innocently. "Mum was talking about a secret, and I want to know what secret that is." That night, after putting the girls to bed with whispered lullabies and kisses on the forehead, David lay awake staring at the ceiling of the empty bedroom. Sarah's words echoed in his mind like a persistent echo, creating theories and possibilities that he didn't want to consider. He knew his wife better than anyone else in the world, or at least that's what he thought. But now he began to question whether he really knew everything about the woman with whom he had shared his life. The letter spoke of family secrets and hidden truths, concepts that seemed completely foreign to the simple and transparent life they had built together. The moon shone through the window, creating patterns of light and shadow on the floor that seemed to form mysterious figures, as if even nature was trying to reveal hidden secrets. "Sarah, what were you trying to tell me?" he murmured into the emptiness of the room. "What truths did you carry alone, my love, and why couldn't you share them with me?" Sleep didn't come easily for David that night, and when he finally managed to fall asleep, his dreams were populated by confusing images of Sarah, whispering words that he couldn't understand. He woke up several times during the night, always with the feeling that there was something important he was forgetting, something crucial that was right on the tip of his tongue, but that escaped every time he tried to remember. When the sun finally rose, David had been awake for hours, looking out the window and thinking about how he could distract the girls from the heavy atmosphere that had settled in the house since the reading of the mysterious letter. He knew that Madison had noticed his restlessness, and that Emma would ask more questions about the secret mentioned by Sarah if he couldn't divert her attention to other things. "Perhaps it's time we left this house for a few hours," he thought as he watched the movement on the street through the curtain. "The girls need to breathe fresh air and forget for a moment all these complicated issues." The next morning, David woke his daughters with an animated proposal for a trip around town, his forcibly cheerful voice trying to hide his sleepless night and the worries that consumed his thoughts. Madison and Emma, always willing to engage in any activity that would take their father out of the melancholic state that had become constant, enthusiastically accepted the idea of exploring the streets and perhaps having ice cream at some downtown ice cream parlor. David wore his best clothes, a light blue shirt that Sarah always said enhanced his eyes, and helped the girls get ready with clean dresses and comfortable walking shoes. The sun shone intensely outside, creating a stark contrast with the somber atmosphere that had dominated the house the night before, as if nature itself was offering an opportunity for a new beginning and renewal. "Today we're going to forget all sorrows," declared David as he hugged his two daughters. "We're going to be a happy family enjoying a beautiful sunny day." The three walked through the city streets with light steps, David in the middle holding the hands of his two daughters as they chatted about everything they saw around them. Madison pointed to interesting shop windows and commented on beautiful clothes she would like to wear when she was older, while Emma was enchanted with every dog that passed by and every flower that bloomed in the gardens of houses. The movement of the city brought new life to the small group, and David felt as if he was breathing properly for the first time in weeks, the pressure in his chest gradually diminishing as they moved away from the house loaded with memories and secrets. They passed by squares where children played, fruit stands with sweet and colorful aromas, and street musicians playing cheerful melodies that made Emma want to dance. "Daddy, can I buy a flower to take home?" asked Emma, stopping in front of a flower shop. "I want to put it in Mum's vase, the one that sits in the living room next to her photograph." After buying a small bouquet of white daisies, Sarah's favorite flowers, the three continued walking without a specific destination, simply enjoying the sensation of freedom that came from being away from the four walls that held so many painful memories. David felt as if each step took him a little further from the confusion and unanswered questions that Sarah's letter had planted in his mind. The streets were busy with people coming and going about their lives, children running and laughing, couples walking hand in hand, a symphony of normal life that contrasted drastically with the isolation in which his family had immersed themselves since Sarah's death. When they passed through a more elegant area of the city, with sophisticated shops and refined restaurants, David noticed how Madison observed everything with curiosity, her eyes shining with dreams of a different future. "One day when I grow up," said Madison, looking at a window full of elegant dresses, "I want to have enough money to buy beautiful clothes and take you to dinner in places like these." It was when they passed in front of a particularly luxurious restaurant that Emma released her father's hand and ran to the large glass window, pressing her face against the cold surface while observing the elegant interior with eyes wide with admiration. The establishment was clearly intended for people of means, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, tables covered with immaculate white tablecloths, and impeccably dressed waiters serving dishes that looked like works of art. David and Madison approached little Emma, smiling at the innocent curiosity of the girl, who seemed fascinated by that world of elegance that was so distant from their simple reality. The golden light that emanated from inside the restaurant created a magical contrast with the natural daylight, as if it were a window to an enchanted world where people lived lives completely different from their own. "Daddy, look!" exclaimed Emma with a voice full of enchantment, pointing to the interior of the restaurant. "It's like a fairy tale palace with everything shining and people dressed like princes and princesses." David casually raised his eyes to follow his daughter's gaze, expecting to see just another expensive restaurant, with its usual clientele of well-dressed people dining at elegant tables. But what his eyes found made him stop completely, his blood freezing in his veins, while his brain tried to process a vision that simply could not be real. Sitting at a table near the window with elegant posture and delicate profile partially turned toward the street, was a woman who was absolutely identical to Sarah. It wasn't just a superficial resemblance or an illusion created by longing. It was Sarah in every detail, from the shape of her nose to the way she held her coffee cup, from the specific shine of her hair to the characteristic way she slightly tilted her head when she was thoughtful. David felt his legs weaken and had to lean against the shop window to avoid falling, his eyes fixed on the impossible apparition that was only a few meters away, separated from him only by a glass wall and the cruel reality of death. "This cannot be happening," he muttered to himself, his voice barely a hoarse whisper. "Sarah is dead. I saw her being buried. I held her cold hand for the last time." David's world completely stopped as he observed the impossible figure sitting gracefully at the restaurant table, each of her movements echoing memories he thought he had buried along with Sarah months ago. The woman held a delicate porcelain cup between her fingers, bringing it to her lips with the same natural elegance that Sarah had always demonstrated, even on the simplest mornings at home when she drank coffee in common mugs in their modest kitchen. Her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, capturing the golden light from the crystal chandeliers and creating an almost angelic halo around her face that seemed to have come directly from David's sweetest dreams and most terrifying nightmares. The piano in the background played a soft melody that Sarah used to hum while cooking, completing the surreal atmosphere that made David question his own sanity. "My God, how is this possible?" he muttered with a trembling voice, clutching the window with enough force to leave finger marks on the glass. "Sarah, my Sarah, how can you be here when I saw your body resting in peace in that coffin?" Madison immediately noticed the drastic change in her father's behavior, her protective instincts sharpened by the experience of being the oldest daughter in a house marked by tragedy. She followed David's fixed gaze and also saw the woman through the window, feeling an electric shock run down her spine as she instantly recognized the familiar features she had kissed goodnight thousands of times. Her small hands began to tremble as she tried to process the impossible vision, her young mind struggling to find a logical explanation for something that defied all laws of nature and death. "Daddy, that lady looks a lot like Mommy," Madison whispered in a controlled voice, trying to stay calm despite the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "But this can't be real, can it? Mommy is in heaven, like you always told us." Emma, still too innocent to fully comprehend the impossibility of the situation, simply reacted with the pure heart of a child who recognizes unconditional love even through a glass wall. Her green eyes lit up with an explosive joy she hadn't felt in months, and before David or Madison could stop her, she dropped the bouquet of daisies she was holding and began to tap on the window with her small hands, trying to get the attention of the woman inside. Her palms left small marks on the glass as she hopped on her tiptoes, her pink dress flying around her skinny legs like flower petals being carried by a spring breeze. "Mommy! Mommy!" shouted Emma with all the strength of her small lungs, her high-pitched voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Look here, it's me, your Emma. Why don't you come give me a hug?" The woman inside the restaurant turned slowly toward the window, her movements fluid and graceful, like a dance rehearsed long ago. When her eyes met Emma's through the glass, an expression of genuine surprise took over her face, quickly followed by something that seemed to be recognition mixed with a deep and indescribable emotion. She rose from the table with elegance, leaving the half-full coffee cup and a small leather purse on the chair, her steps clearly directed toward the restaurant door as if she were magnetically attracted to the child's presence outside. "She moves exactly like Sarah," thought David, feeling his legs weaken even more. "Every gesture, every expression, it's as if my wife had returned from the dead to torment me." When the woman emerged through the main door of the restaurant, bringing with her a cloud of the sophisticated perfume that permeated the internal environment, David felt as if he were being transported back in time to the first days of his relationship with Sarah. The air around her seemed to vibrate with a familiar energy that made every cell in his body instinctively recognize the presence that had been the anchor of his life for so many years. Emma immediately ran toward the woman with open arms, her childlike confidence not allowing any hesitation or fear in the face of the extraordinary situation that was unfolding before her innocent eyes. "My little one," said the woman in a soft and melodious voice that made David shudder to his core. "You are even more beautiful than I imagined you would be." The embrace between Emma and the mysterious woman lasted an eternity frozen in time, with the child nestling against her chest like a little bird that finally found its nest after a long storm. The woman caressed Emma's golden hair with smooth and familiar movements, her fingers intertwining with the silky curls, exactly the same way that Sarah used to do during nightly hair-brushing sessions before bedtime. "Mommy, I knew you would come back to us," whimpered Emma with a voice choked by tears of happiness. "I prayed every night asking God to bring you back, and now here you are, more beautiful than ever." David finally managed to force his trembling legs to move, approaching the group with faltering steps that revealed the conflict between his desperate heart and his rational mind. When he got close enough to clearly see the details of the woman's face, he felt as if he had been punched in the stomach, expelling all the air from his lungs at once. Every line, every curve, every small mark that he had memorized during years of shared love was there, perfect and unchanged, as if Sarah had simply gone out for a walk and decided to stop for coffee in an elegant place. "Sarah?" he whispered in a hoarse voice, extending a trembling hand toward her face. "How is it possible? How can you be here when I carried your coffin with my own hands?" The woman gently pulled away from Emma's embrace and rose slowly, her graceful movements creating a respectful distance between her and David, while her eyes revealed a complex mixture of emotions that included surprise, compassion, and something that seemed like deeply buried guilt. She extended her hands in a calming gesture, as if trying to soothe a wounded animal, her long and elegant fingers trembling slightly under the weight of the extraordinary situation that had materialized in front of the elegant restaurant. "Please don't be alarmed," she said softly, looking alternately at David and the two girls. "I completely understand your confusion, but I am not Sarah. My name is Hannah, and I can explain everything if you allow me a few minutes to talk." Hannah's declaration hit David like lightning on a sunny afternoon, leaving him stunned and questioning not only what he was seeing, but also his own ability to distinguish between reality and fantasy. Madison positioned herself protectively beside her father, her young but astute eyes studying every nuance of Hannah's expression for signs of lies or deception. Emma, on the other hand, remained glued to the woman's leg like a vine clinging to a tree, her childish mind completely rejecting the possibility that this was not her beloved mother miraculously returning from the dead. "Hannah," he repeated the name slowly, as if experimenting with a word in a foreign language. "But you are identical to her, absolutely identical. How is this possible? You must be a sister, a cousin, some relative that Sarah never mentioned." Hannah lowered her eyes for a moment, as if she were internally struggling about how much of the truth she could reveal in that first encounter. When she looked back at David, there was in her eyes a depth of knowledge and experience that suggested she knew much more about the situation than she was willing to immediately admit. She bent down again to be at Emma's height, gently holding the child's little face between her hands, while speaking in a sweet but firm voice. "Darling, I know you confused me with someone very special," said Hannah, looking into Emma's green eyes. "But I need you to understand that, although I may look like that person, I am someone different. Can you be brave and help me explain this to your daddy?" Hannah suggested that they find a more private location to talk, and they walked to a quiet square where they sat on a shaded bench. The pastoral setting contrasted with the emotional tension that permeated the group, creating a surreal atmosphere for the revelations that were to come. Hannah took a deep breath before beginning to speak, as if preparing to reveal long-kept secrets. "David, what I'm going to tell you may be difficult to believe," she began with a soft but firm voice. "But I swear by Sarah's memory that everything I'm going to say is the absolute truth." The mention of Sarah's name made David shudder, and he leaned forward, giving Hannah his full attention while his heart beat erratically. Hannah adjusted Emma more comfortably on her lap, her automatic movements revealing a genuine maternal instinct. The distant sound of children playing created a gentle soundtrack for the revelation that was about to happen. "Sarah and I were sisters," said Hannah, her words falling like stones in a tranquil lake. "More than that, we were identical twins, separated when we were very young by circumstances that at the time seemed necessary, but that I now understand caused unnecessary pain for everyone involved." The revelation hit David like an emotional tsunami, making him feel as if the entire ground beneath his feet had instantly disappeared. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably as he tried to process the information that completely recontextualized everything he thought he knew about Sarah's life. Madison let out a small cry of surprise, while Emma simply snuggled closer to Hannah, content to be in the arms of someone who felt like home. "Twins?" repeated David hoarsely, as if the word were foreign in his language. "Sarah never mentioned having a sister, let alone a twin. How is this possible? Why would she keep such an important secret?" Hannah explained with a voice laden with emotion how her father had made the decision to separate them when they were babies, believing it would be better for the family's safety, but that she grew up knowing that somewhere in the world there was a half of her living the life that should have been shared. David took a faded photograph of Sarah in her wedding dress from his wallet, extending it to Hannah with trembling hands. "This is Sarah on our wedding day," he said with a choked voice. "If you truly were twins, then you lost not just a sister, but an entire life of moments that should have been shared." Hannah held the photograph with reverence, as if she were holding a sacred relic, and when she saw the image of Sarah in the wedding dress, a single tear escaped from her eyes. She delicately traced the outline of Sarah's face in the photograph, her fingers trembling as she memorized every detail of her lost sister. "She was beautiful," whispered Hannah, her voice almost lost in the wind. "I can see in this photo that she was loved and happy, and it gives me some peace knowing that at least one of us, managed to have the life we both deserved. It was at this moment that David noticed something that made his blood freeze completely in his veins. Shining discreetly on the ring finger of Hannah's right hand, capturing a ray of sunlight and reflecting it directly into his eyes, was a ring that he instantly recognized. It was the wedding ring that he himself had carefully chosen years ago, the same ring he had placed on Sarah's finger during their wedding ceremony, the same unique ring with a specific design that he had specially commissioned for her. "That ring," said David with a trembling voice pointing to Hannah's hand. "Where did you get that ring?" "It belonged to Sarah. I placed it on her finger myself on our wedding day." Hannah followed David's gaze to her own hand, and when she realized what he was seeing, visibly paled and tried to hide her hand behind her back, but it was too late. David had seen, and the presence of the ring raised questions that she clearly wasn't prepared to answer. Emma, sensing the sudden tension, looked alternately at Hannah and David with confusion, not understanding why the atmosphere had changed so drastically. "Hannah," said David, his voice now carrying distrust, "you need to explain to me how you have my dead wife's wedding ring. That ring should have been buried with her, and there's no logical explanation for you to be wearing it." Hannah abruptly stood up from the bench, causing Emma to slip from her lap, looking up with a worried expression upon realizing that something had drastically changed in the woman's mood. Hannah's hands were visibly shaking as she tried to find words to explain the inexplicable, but her ability to speak seemed to have completely abandoned her in the face of the implicit accusation in David's eyes. She looked around the square as if searching for an escape route, her eyes revealing a mixture of panic and guilt. I can explain," stammered Hannah, but her words sounded weak and unconvincing. "But not here, not now, not with the children present. There are things you don't understand, truths that are more complicated than they seem." David also stood up, his height and intimidating posture contrasting with Hannah's fragile figure, who seemed to be shrinking before his eyes. Madison quickly positioned herself next to Emma, holding her younger sister's hand in a protective gesture. The square now felt like a stage for a drama that was about to explode in devastating proportions. "Hannah or Sarah or whoever you are," said David, his voice growing in intensity, "you're going to explain to me right now how you have this ring. I buried my wife, I saw her body, I held her cold hand for the last time. If you're really her twin sister, how do you explain wearing her wedding ring?" The direct accusation made Hannah recoil as if she had received a physical slap, and she let out a small sob before abruptly turning and beginning to move away from the bench. In her rush to escape, she dropped the white linen napkin she had been holding, the delicate fabric floating to the ground like a flag of surrender. Emma immediately ran after her, her small steps trying to keep up with Hannah's longer strides, while shouting for her not to leave. "Hannah, wait!" shouted David, running after her with Madison at his side. "You can't just walk away after appearing in our lives like this. I need answers, my daughters need answers." Hannah moved through the square with surprising speed, her low-heeled shoes creating a staccato rhythm against the pavement as she navigated between people who were strolling peacefully, unaware of the drama unfolding. David followed her determinedly, staying close enough not to lose sight of her, but far enough not to cause a public scene. The streets began to become less illuminated as Hannah led them away from the center and toward older neighborhoods, where the afternoon shadows created dark corridors between buildings. "Where is she taking us?" whispered Madison to David, her voice revealing growing concern. "Dad, maybe we should go back home and try to understand all of this more calmly." But David was too determined to get answers to consider giving up, especially after seeing Sarah's ring on Hannah's hand. Each step he took was motivated by an explosive mixture of desperate hope, growing suspicion and paternal love that drove him to protect his daughters by discovering the truth about the mysterious woman. Hannah continued moving through the streets with definite purpose, leading them through increasingly empty blocks, where streetlights began to create more shadows than illumination. When Hannah finally stopped, it was in front of a small, seemingly abandoned park, where rusted playground equipment rose like skeletons in the approaching twilight. "She stopped," observed David, his breathing heavy from running and emotional tension. "Whatever place she was leading us to, we've arrived." The abandoned park stretched before them like a cemetery of lost childhoods, with rusted toys that had once echoed with children's laughter, but now served only as silent monuments to the neglect of time. David paused at the entrance, observing Hannah, who had stopped near a broken swing. Her back turned to him as she tried to catch her breath after the desperate run through the increasingly deserted streets. The tall trees created a cathedral of dense shadows that swallowed the remaining twilight light, transforming the place into a perfect stage for revelations that preferred to hide from the clarity of day. Madison firmly held Emma's hand, both girls staying close to the park entrance, instinctively wary of venturing deeper into that place that seemed to breathe ancient secrets and abandonments. "Hannah, enough running," declared David with a firm voice, breaking the oppressive silence that had settled between them. "This place may be haunted by ghosts of the past, but I won't let you escape without giving me the answers my family deserves." Hannah turned slowly, revealing tears that glistened on her cheeks like pearls under the faint light that still filtered through the dense foliage of the century-old trees. Her hair was slightly disheveled from running, and her breathing still came in short bursts that made her chest rise and fall irregularly, but there was in her posture a resignation that hadn't been present in previous moments. She walked to a partially broken wooden bench and sat down heavily, as if the weight of decades of secrets was finally taking its physical and emotional toll. David approached cautiously, maintaining enough distance to give her space, but close enough to ensure she wouldn't attempt another desperate escape through the growing shadows of the forgotten park. "David, I know you have every right to be furious with me," said Hannah with a choked voice, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. "But before you judge me completely, you need to understand that there are truths about your family that are far more dangerous than you can imagine." Hannah's words echoed among the abandoned toys like a dark omen, making David feel a chill run down his spine as he tried to decipher the meaning behind the veiled warning. Madison and Emma remained near the entrance, but David could sense they were listening to every word of the conversation, absorbing information that could fundamentally change their understanding of their own family history. The night wind began to blow through the trees, creating a whispering symphony that seemed to be telling stories from other times when that park was still a place of joy instead of a repository of buried secrets. David sat at the opposite end of the bench, keeping his eyes fixed on Hannah's profile as he tried to reconcile the broken woman before him with the radiant apparition he had seen at the restaurant. "Dangerous truths?" repeated David, his voice laden with skepticism and growing impatience. "Hannah, you're wearing my dead wife's wedding ring. You appear out of nowhere claiming to be her twin sister, and now you talk about dangers. What kind of truths could be so dangerous that would justify all these secrets?" Hannah took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into deep and treacherous waters, and when she began to speak, her voice carried the weight of years of forced silence and accumulated guilt. She told how she and Sarah had been born into a family that wasn't as simple as David had believed. A family where decisions were made by powerful men who saw daughters as pieces in complex games of power and influence. The two girls had been separated when they were just a few months old, not by chance or financial difficulties, but because their father had made dangerous enemies who threatened to use the children as leverage against him. Hannah grew up in another city, raised by a surrogate family that had been paid to keep her safe and hidden, always knowing she had a sister somewhere, but never having permission to look for her until it was safe to do so. "David, you need to understand that our father wasn't just an ordinary merchant, as Sarah probably told you," revealed Hannah, her words coming out in a controlled flow of emotion. "He was involved in businesses that attracted the kind of attention no family should have to face, and the separation of two young daughters was the price he paid to keep at least one of them completely safe." The revelation about Sarah's family background hit David like an avalanche of information he had never suspected, forcing him to question not only what he knew about his wife, but also the very foundations of his family life. He remembered Sarah's mysterious letter that he had read the night before, with its enigmatic references to secrets that could only be revealed in the future, and began to understand that those words weren't just the delusions of a dying woman, but carefully planned warnings about truths she knew would eventually come to light. Madison had moved slightly closer, her sharp ears catching pieces of the conversation that painted a completely different portrait of the grandmother she thought she knew, while Emma played distractedly with a flower she had found on the ground, oblivious to the seismic implications of the revelations being shared. "So you're telling me that Sarah knew about you all along?" asked David, his voice revealing a mixture of betrayal and confusion. "She knew she had a twin sister living in secret somewhere and never told me. How could she keep something so important from me during all the years we were together?" Hannah slowly shook her head, her tears falling more freely now as she explained that Sarah had been instructed from a very young age to never mention her sister's existence, not only to protect Hannah, but also to protect Sarah herself and any family she might form in the future. Their father had been very specific about the risks involved, explaining that as long as Hannah remained hidden and Sarah lived a completely normal and transparent life, both would be safe from enemies who might still be looking for ways to harm the family. Hannah had spent decades living with a completely fabricated identity, working ordinary jobs, living in small towns, always moving when she felt she might be drawing unnecessary attention to herself. It was only when Sarah died that Hannah felt she could finally try to establish some kind of connection with the family she had lost, before even having the chance to know them. "Sarah didn't keep this secret from you out of malice or lack of trust, David," Hannah explained, looking directly into his eyes for the first time since they had sat down. "She kept it because she loved you and the girls enough to protect you from complications that could put all your lives at risk." David felt as if the ground beneath his feet was gradually crumbling, each revelation creating deeper cracks in his understanding of the reality he had carefully built over the years. He looked at his daughters, noting how Madison was processing everything with a seriousness beyond her years, while Emma remained blissfully unaware of the magnitude of the changes occurring in their family understanding. The park around them seemed to be growing darker with each passing minute, the trees creating ghostly shapes against the rapidly darkening sky, but David knew he couldn't leave that conversation incomplete, no matter how uncomfortable or destabilizing it became. "And the ring," pressed David, pointing to Hannah's hand where Sarah's wedding ring faintly gleamed in the decreasing light. "How do you explain wearing the ring that I placed on Sarah's finger at the altar, the ring that should have been buried with her? That's the part that doesn't make sense in your whole story, Hannah." Hannah looked at the ring on her hand as if seeing it for the first time, and when she spoke, her voice was laden with such deep sadness that it made David feel a pang of compassion despite his confusion and anger. She explained that, in the final days before Sarah's death, her sister had managed to make contact with her through a trusted attorney, sending a letter along with some personal belongings, including the wedding ring. Sarah had expressed the wish that Hannah should have something tangible to remember the sister. She never had the chance to properly know, and the ring had been chosen because it represented the love and happiness Sarah had found in her life with David and the girls. Hannah had initially hesitated to wear the ring, but in moments of greatest loneliness and grief for her sister's loss, she had begun to wear it as a way to feel connected to the family she had lost before even having the opportunity to be part of it. "David, I know how this must look to you, and I completely understand if you can't believe me," said Hannah, carefully removing the ring from her finger and extending it toward him. "But Sarah wanted me to have this, wanted me to know that even separated we were still sisters, still family." David took the ring with trembling hands, slowly turning it to find the internal inscription that he himself had ordered engraved years ago, "Forever United." The sight of the familiar words in such a surreal context finally made his tears flow, not only for the renewed loss of Sarah, but for the understanding that his wife had carried this enormous burden of family secrets throughout their life together. He imagined Sarah in her final days, sick and knowing she was dying, making the brave decision to finally contact her lost sister and ensure that at least some family connection survived her departure. Hannah silently watched as David processed the conflicting emotions that were passing across his face, and Madison had moved close enough to see the ring in her father's hands, her eyes widening as she recognized the familiar jewel. "So Mom really did have a sister," Madison murmured, more to herself than to the adults. "And she could never tell us about it because she was trying to protect us from some kind of danger." Hannah was about to respond when a sudden movement in the shadows near the rusty playground equipment caught her attention, making her abruptly stop speaking and turn toward the source of the disturbance. David followed her gaze and saw a male figure partially hidden behind a broken slide. a man wearing a dark hat that obscured his facial features, but whose posture suggested he had been watching and listening to the conversation for a considerable time. The man was clearly trying to remain hidden, but his presence had been revealed by a misstep that made the dry leaves on the ground rustle loudly enough to break the relative silence of the abandoned park. Hannah immediately tensed, her hands closing into fists while her eyes narrowed with what appeared to be recognition, mixed with genuine fear. "David, we need to leave here now," Hannah whispered urgently, quickly rising from the broken bench. "That man shouldn't be here, and his presence means it might not be safe anymore for you and the girls to be involved in all of this." The man in the hat, realizing he had been discovered, tried to retreat deeper into the shadows of the park, but his awkward movement caused him to trip on an exposed root of one of the ancient trees. David watched with growing alarm as the stranger struggled to maintain his balance, clearly panicking at having been detected spying on the family. Hannah had instinctively moved to a protective position between David and the mysterious man, her body language revealing a familiarity with dangerous situations that didn't match the image of an ordinary woman she had painted of herself. Madison quickly pulled Emma closer to her, both girls finally realizing that something was definitely wrong with the entire situation that had unfolded since the moment they saw Hannah at the restaurant. "Who is that man?" asked David, his voice low but loaded with paternal authority. "Hannah, you obviously recognize him, so tell me who he is and why his presence here puts us in danger." Before Hannah could answer, the man in the hat abruptly turned and began running toward the opposite exit of the park, his footsteps echoing against the hard ground as he moved with the desperate urgency of someone who had been caught doing something he shouldn't. David instinctively began to move to chase him, his protective instincts screaming that he needed to know who was watching his family and why, but Hannah quickly grabbed his arm, preventing him from following the stranger into the growing darkness that extended beyond the limits of the abandoned park. The man disappeared among the trees with surprising speed, leaving only the echo of his hurried steps and a silence charged with tension that made everyone present realize they had just witnessed something significantly ominous. In the rush of his escape, the mysterious man had dropped something that landed on the ground near the broken slide where he had been hiding, a white envelope that contrasted dramatically with the dark leaves and dirty soil of the neglected park. "Let him go," said Hannah, her voice revealing a mixture of relief and renewed concern. "What's important now is to find out what he left behind, because something tells me it wasn't an accident." David gently freed himself from Hannah's grip and walked cautiously toward the fallen envelope, his senses on high alert as he scanned the park for signs that other observers might be hiding in the growing shadows. Madison and Emma remained close to Hannah, who had assumed a protective stance that revealed experience with potentially dangerous situations, a facet of her personality that had not been apparent during their previous interactions. The envelope was slightly crumpled from the fall, but appeared to be intact, and when David picked it up, he noticed it was heavy enough to contain more than just a simple letter. His hands trembled slightly as he carefully opened the envelope, aware that whatever was inside would likely further change his understanding of a situation that had already become much more complex than he could ever have imagined. "Hannah, what do you think might be in here?" asked David, hesitating before fully revealing the contents of the envelope. "And please be honest with me this time, because I need to know exactly what we're getting into before exposing my daughters to more risks." Hannah approached cautiously, her eyes fixed on the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode, and when David finally removed the contents, both stood in shocked silence at seeing what had been left behind by the mysterious observer. Inside the envelope were several black and white photographs, clearly old and slightly faded by time, but still sharp enough to reveal details that made David's heart momentarily stop. The photographs showed two young girls, clearly identical twins, embracing and smiling at the camera with the carefree joy of childhood, and even decades later, it was impossible not to recognize that the girls in the photographs were Sarah and Hannah. There were photographs of them playing together, others where they appeared dressed identically for special occasions, and some that seemed to have been taken just days or weeks before they were separated forever. David held the photographs with reverence, as if he were holding precious fragments of a life that Sarah had lost and that Hannah had spent decades trying to recover. "My God," whispered David, his voice hoarse with emotion. "These really are the two of you, aren't they? You and Sarah together before all this happened?" Hannah nodded slowly, tears flowing freely down her face as she looked at the photographs that captured moments of happiness that had been brutally interrupted by decisions of adults that the two girls had no power to influence. She pointed to a specific photograph where the two girls were wearing identical dresses and holding dolls that appeared to have been birthday presents, explaining that that had been one of the last times they had been together before the separation that would change their lives forever. Madison had moved close enough to see the photographs over her father's shoulder, and her expression revealed fascination mixed with sadness as she saw her mother as a happy child alongside the sister she had never known. Emma, still too young to fully comprehend the historical implications of the images, simply pointed to the girls in the photographs and asked if one of them was her mommy when she was little. "David, I don't know how that man got these photographs," said Hannah, her voice revealing genuine confusion and concern. "These are photos that should be kept safe, photographs that few people in the world should have access to, and the fact that he was carrying them means that someone is investigating very deeply into our family history." The implication that someone was actively investigating the family made David feel a mixture of paranoia and paternal protection that made him look around the abandoned park with new suspicion, as if each shadow could be hiding other observers with unknown motives. He carefully put the photographs back in the envelope, aware that they represented precious evidence not only of Hannah and Sarah's history, but also that external forces were clearly interested in his family for reasons he had not yet fully understood. Hannah seemed to be struggling internally about how much more of the truth she could reveal without putting David and the girls in even greater danger. But the discovery of the photographs had clearly forced the situation beyond the point where partial secrets were still sufficient. The night wind had intensified, making the trees whisper with more urgency, as if nature itself was trying to warn them that they had remained in the abandoned park for too long. "Hannah, I need you to tell me exactly who else knows about you, about Sarah, about this whole story," said David, his voice loaded with paternal determination. "My daughters cannot be in danger because of family secrets they didn't even know they were part of." Hannah looked directly into David's eyes, and he could see that she was making a decision that she knew would change everything irreversibly, a decision that would take her beyond the point of no return in terms of exposing truths she had kept for decades. She took a deep breath, as if preparing herself to reveal the final secret that would make it impossible to return to the simple life that David and his daughters had known before that extraordinary day. The shadows of the park seemed to be closing in around them, creating a sense of urgency that made each second seem precious and potentially dangerous at the same time. When Hannah finally spoke, her voice was loaded with a gravity that made David understand that they were about to cross a line that would take them into completely unknown and potentially dangerous territory. "David, there is one person who knows the whole truth about our family, someone who was involved in all the decisions that separated Sarah and me, someone who may have the answers you're looking for," said Hannah, her words coming out slowly as if each of them weighed a ton. "But seeking him means accepting that your life will never be the same again, and that you may discover truths about Sarah that may be harder to accept than her death itself." David felt a chill run down his spine when Hannah mentioned this mysterious figure who had apparently been instrumental in separating the twin sisters, but his need to protect his daughters and fully understand the situation they were in overcame any hesitation he might have had about proceeding. He looked at Madison and Emma, seeing in their young faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and confidence that their father would do whatever necessary to keep them safe, regardless of how complicated or dangerous the situation became. The photographs in his hands seemed to burn with the intensity of the truths they represented, and he knew he couldn't simply ignore the implications of his discovery and return to normal life as if nothing had happened. "Who is this person?" asked David, his voice firm despite the whirlwind of emotions he was experiencing. "Hannah, if there's someone who can give me complete answers about this whole situation, then I need to speak with that person, no matter how difficult the truths may be." Hannah hesitated for a long moment, looking alternately at David and the girls, clearly weighing the risks of revealing information that could put the entire family in an even more vulnerable position. When she finally spoke, her voice was loaded with years of hurt and resentment that had been carefully suppressed, but which now sprouted to the surface like an old wound that had never properly healed. She explained that the person who possessed all the answers was their own father, the man who had made the decision to separate the twin daughters when they were babies, the man who had spent decades living with the weight of that choice, and the man whom David knew as his father-in-law, William. The revelation that William had been involved in the separation of the sisters and had kept this secret during all the years that David had been part of the family made the world spin around him, forcing him to reconsider every interaction he had had with the man he had respected as a father figure. "David, I know this is a lot to process, but William is the only person alive who can tell you the whole story," said Hannah, her voice trembling but determined. "He is the one who decided that Sarah would live a normal life while I remained hidden. And he is the one who can explain why that man was watching us and why someone is still interested in our family after all these years." David looked at the envelope containing the precious photographs, then at Hannah, whose face revealed decades of pain caused by family secrets, and finally at his own daughters who depended on him to navigate through this storm of revelations that had transformed his understanding of everything he thought he knew about his life. The darkness of the abandoned park seemed to be closing around them like a physical metaphor for the confusion and uncertainty that had swallowed his previously stable existence. But David knew there was no turning back now that the truths had begun to emerge. He made a decision that he knew would change the course of their lives forever, a decision motivated by love for his daughters and the need to protect them by fully understanding the forces that might be working against his family. "Then let's talk to William," declared David, his voice loaded with renewed determination. "If he has the answers we need, if he can explain why my family is being watched and why Sarah carried these secrets throughout her life, then it's time for all the truths to come to light." Hannah stared at him with an expression that mixed relief with terror, as if she knew that David's decision was necessary, but also extremely dangerous for everyone involved. She looked one last time around the abandoned park, as if saying goodbye to a place that had become significant in her personal journey, before slowly nodding in agreement with the plan to confront the man who had shaped their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. The old photographs seemed to pulse with their own energy in the envelope David held, as if the images of Sarah and Hannah as children were begging for the truths about their separate lives to finally be fully revealed. "You shouldn't have seen this," said Hannah with a trembling voice, pointing to the photographs that had been left by the mysterious observer. "But now that you have, there's no going back, and we need to be prepared to discover truths that might be more devastating than anything we've ever faced." William's mansion rose before them like a monument to the past, its ancient stone walls witnessing decades of family secrets that were finally about to come to light under the most dramatic circumstances possible. David firmly held the envelope containing the revealing photographs as he walked down the stone pathway that led to the main door of the imposing property, his steps echoing against the silence of the night that had completely fallen over the city. Hannah walked at his side with a tense expression, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings of the mansion, as if expecting to see other observers hidden among the centennial trees that protected the property from the view of onlookers. Madison and Emma followed close to their father, both impressed by the grandeur of their grandfather's house, but also aware of the atmosphere laden with tension that had settled among the adults since the discovery in the abandoned park. "Daddy, why does Grandpa's house look like a haunted castle tonight?" asked Emma in a small voice, holding David's hand more firmly. "There's something different here that's making me scared, as if ghosts were watching us through the dark windows." The long corridors of the mansion seemed to extend infinitely when David finally rang the ornate doorbell, the sound echoing through the thick walls like a ghostly lament announcing long-delayed confrontations. The heavy curtains on the windows were all closed, creating a claustrophobic atmosphere that dramatically contrasted with the natural elegance of the colonial architecture that William had meticulously preserved over the years. David could hear slow footsteps approaching the door from the other side, each sound amplified by the oppressive silence that had settled over the entire property like an invisible mantle of apprehension. When the door finally opened, it revealed William in a dark silk robe, his grey hair disheveled and his expression showing genuine surprise at seeing the entire family gathered before his door at such a late hour. "David, girls, what an unexpected surprise," said William, his voice laden with caution as his eyes quickly fixed on Hannah before returning to David. "I hope nothing serious has happened for you to appear here at this hour of the night, especially with the children." David entered the mansion without waiting for a formal invitation, his paternal determination overcoming any consideration for social etiquette as he guided his daughters through the entrance hall that displayed imposing family portraits that told visual stories of past generations. Hannah hesitated at the threshold, clearly nervous about entering the house of the father, who had made the decision to separate her from her twin sister decades ago, but David gestured for her to accompany them, knowing that her presence would be crucial for the confrontation that was about to happen. William closed the door behind them with a deliberately slow movement, as if trying to gain time to process the unexpected situation that had materialized in his elegantly decorated living room. The paintings on the walls seemed to observe the group with ancestral eyes that had witnessed decades of family decisions, some wise and others that had left permanent scars on the lives of innocent people. "William, we need to talk about some very important things we discovered today," declared David, his voice echoing through the main room with authority that admitted no evasions. "And before you try to deny or minimize anything, know that we have physical evidence that makes it impossible to continue hiding the truth." William led the group to the main room of the mansion, a grand environment dominated by a solid wood table that had served as the center of family decisions for generations, its polished surfaces reflecting the golden light from crystal chandeliers that hung majestically from the ornate ceiling. The pendulum clock in the corner of the room marked each second with metronomic precision, its ticking creating a hypnotic soundtrack for the confrontation that everyone knew was about to explode with devastating force. Madison and Emma sat in upholstered chairs near the fireplace, their large eyes observing every movement of the adults with the sharp perception of children who know when important situations are unfolding around them. Hannah remained standing near the entrance of the room, as if prepared for a quick escape if the situation became intolerable, while David positioned himself directly in front of William with the envelope of photographs held firmly in his hands as irrefutable evidence. "William, I want you to look at these photographs and explain to me how it's possible that Sarah had a twin sister, about whom she never told me during all the years we were married," said David, removing the black and white images from the envelope and spreading them across the wooden table. "And I want you to explain why this woman here," he continued, pointing to Hannah, "is absolutely identical to my deceased wife and is wearing the wedding ring that I placed on Sarah's finger." William's face visibly paled when his eyes fixed on the photographs scattered across the table, his hands trembling slightly as he picked them up one by one to examine with attention that revealed immediate and deep recognition. David observed every micro-expression on his father-in-law's face, noticing how the years seemed to instantly accumulate in his features as he processed not only the images of his young daughters, but also the implications of their discovery by David and his granddaughters. Hannah stepped forward, emerging from the shadows of the entrance to stand in the full light of the chandeliers, allowing William to see her clearly for the first time in decades, and the recognition in his eyes was instantaneous and devastating. The pendulum clock continued its relentless rhythm, each tick-tock seeming to amplify the tension that grew exponentially as William struggled internally about how much of the truth he could or should reveal. "William, your silence is confirming everything Hannah told me," pressed David, his voice growing in intensity. "Now I want to hear from you, from the man I respected as a father, how you could separate twin baby sisters and allow one of them to grow up without ever knowing her own family." William placed the photographs carefully on the table, as if they were sacred relics that might disintegrate if handled too roughly, and when he finally raised his eyes to meet David's accusing gaze, there was in them a depth of guilt and regret that had accumulated over decades of questionable decisions. He sat heavily in the main chair at the table, his posture revealing the weight of secrets he had carried alone for too long. And when he began to speak, his voice was laden with an exhaustion that went far beyond physical tiredness. Hannah approached the table, her eyes fixed on the man who had shaped her life with a decision made when she was too small to have any voice in the matter, and David could see the complex mixture of anger, sadness, and curiosity that danced in her expression as she waited for explanations she had craved for decades. "David, there are truths about our family that I hope to take to the grave," admitted William, his hoarse voice revealing years of repressed guilt. "Truths that I decided to hide to protect all the people I loved, but that I now realize may have caused more pain than protection." William's partial confession created an emotionally charged pause in the majestic room, the silence being broken only by the persistent tick-tock of the pendulum clock that seemed to be counting down to revelations that would fundamentally change everyone's understanding of their family history. David leaned forward in his chair, his fists clenched on the wooden table, as he tried to control the growing anger he felt at having been kept in the dark about such fundamental aspects of his wife's life. Hannah remained standing, her tense posture revealing decades of unanswered questions that could finally find resolution, while Madison and Emma silently observed, absorbing pieces of a family history that was proving to be much more complex than anything they could have imagined. "William, stop speaking in half-words and tell me the whole truth," demanded David, tapping the table lightly with enough force to make the photographs jump. "Sarah is dead. Hannah has spent decades in hiding, and my family is apparently being watched by strangers. It's time for all the cards to be on the table, no more secrets or half-truths." William took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into deep and turbulent waters he had carefully avoided for decades, and when he began to speak again, it was with the slow cadence of someone who knew that each word could have irreversible consequences. He explained how the twins had been born at a particularly dangerous time for the family, when he had become involved in business dealings that attracted the attention of violent people who would not hesitate to use innocent children as instruments of pressure and blackmail. The decision to separate the girls had been made after several specific threats against the family, including one occasion when armed men had appeared on the property looking for ways to pressure William into making concessions in business deals that could have financially ruined several innocent families. Hannah was given to a trusted family who agreed to raise her as their own daughter, while Sarah remained with William, who hoped that keeping only one daughter visible would make the entire family less vulnerable to targeted attacks. "David, you have to understand that there were no easy choices back then," William explained, his hands trembling as he held one of the photographs. "I could lose both daughters to violent people, or I could save at least one of them, ensuring that the other would grow up safe and protected away from all danger." David felt as if he were hearing the story of a family completely different from the one he had known throughout all the years of marriage to Sarah, a family involved in types of danger and complexity that dramatically contrasted with the simple and quiet life he had built with his wife. Hannah moved even closer to the table, her eyes fixed on William with an intensity that revealed decades of accumulated questions about the circumstances of her separation from her biological family. Madison had leaned forward in her chair, clearly fascinated by the story that was painting a completely new portrait of her maternal family, while Emma played distractedly with the folds of her dress, still too young to fully comprehend the dramatic implications of the revelations that were being shared. The atmosphere in the room seemed to be getting heavier with each word William uttered, as if decades of secrets were finally finding their voice through long-delayed confessions. "So you're telling me that Sarah grew up knowing she had a twin sister hidden somewhere?" asked David, his voice revealing incredulity mixed with betrayal. "She knew about Hannah during all the years we were together, and chose to keep this secret from me, from the man with whom she shared her life and had children." William slowly shook his head, explaining that Sarah had been instructed from a very young age to never mention Hannah's existence, not only to protect her sister, but also to protect any family Sarah might form in the future. The decision to keep Hannah completely separate and secret had been made with the hope that if William's enemies ever discovered Sarah, they would have no knowledge of a second daughter who could be used as additional leverage. Hannah had grown up with a loving adoptive family who knew about her origins, but had agreed to keep her safe and hidden until it was determined that there was no more danger to any of the parties involved. It was only after Sarah's death that Hannah felt she could finally try to establish some kind of connection with the family she had lost. But even then, she had hesitated for months before gathering the courage to seek out David and the granddaughters she had never met. "Hannah isn't lying about anything she told you," William confirmed, looking directly at David. "She really is my daughter, Sarah's twin sister, and the ring she's wearing was indeed sent by Sarah through a lawyer in the weeks before her death." William's official confirmation of Hannah's identity and the legitimacy of her story created an emotional pause in the room where David tried to fully process the implications of decades of family secrets that had shaped his life in ways he had never understood. Hannah finally sat down, as if the weight of finally having her identity confirmed by her biological father had removed a burden she had carried for entire decades. David looked at his daughters, noticing that Madison was observing Hannah with new understanding, finally realizing that the strange woman Emma had called Mommy was actually her aunt, her deceased mother's lost sister. The pendulum clock continued its hypnotic rhythm, but now its sound seemed less ominous and more comforting, as if time was finally moving in the direction of resolution rather than concealment. "William, I need you to tell me about the people who were threatening our family," said David, his voice calmer but still laden with determination. "If someone is still watching us, if that man in the park was sent by people who still represent danger, then I need to know exactly what we're dealing with." William visibly hesitated, his eyes revealing an internal struggle between the desire to protect the family through continued silence and the understanding that the secrets had already been exposed beyond the point where additional concealment would be possible or effective. He rose from the table and walked to one of the windows in the room, slightly pulling back the heavy curtain to look out at the dark gardens of the property, as if checking whether unwanted observers might be hidden among the century-old trees. David observed William's behavior with growing apprehension, realizing that his father-in-law's hesitation suggested that the dangers of the past might not be as buried as he had hoped. Hannah also appeared visibly tense, as if David's words about current observers had touched on fears she had tried to suppress since her decision to make contact with the family. "David, there are some people from the past that I hoped had completely forgotten about our family," admitted William, his voice low as if he feared being heard even within his own home. "But if someone is still watching us, if that man in the park was really investigating you, then it's possible that old enemies still see our family as relevant to their own interests." Before William could continue his explanation about the potential dangers that might still be lurking around the family, a loud sound broke the tranquility of the mansion, making everyone duck as the windows shattered. It was clearly an attack directed at the family, and David immediately protected his daughters while they sought safe shelter. Hannah had thrown herself behind the solid wooden table, using it as an improvised shield, while William remained near the broken window, apparently paralyzed by the shock of seeing his worst fears materialize before his eyes. The pendulum clock, hit by glass fragments, fell from the wall with a metallic crash that echoed through the room like a funeral lament, its hands abruptly stopping at an hour that would forever be associated with the moment when family secrets finally brought violent consequences to real life. "Stay down!" David shouted to his daughters, trying to protect them with his own body while quickly assessing the situation. "Don't raise your head until I say it's safe." Screams echoed through the long corridors of the mansion, coming from multiple directions, that suggested the attack had not been executed by a single shooter, but by a coordinated group that had completely surrounded the property before initiating their assault. David could hear sounds of glass breaking in other parts of the house, indicating that the main room had not been the only target, but that the entire mansion was under simultaneous attack by people who clearly knew exactly where to find the family gathered. William finally reacted to the chaos around him, crawling away from the broken window and toward the table where the others were sheltering, his face revealing genuine terror mixed with overwhelming guilt for having brought danger to his family through decisions made decades ago. Hannah had become visibly pale, as if she were reliving nightmares from her childhood about the dangers that had necessitated her separation from the family, and David could see in her eyes that she immediately understood the implications of the coordinated attack. "William, who are these people?" David shouted over the sound of more glass breaking in other parts of the mansion. "What do they want from our family, and how do we stop this before someone gets hurt?" William looked around the devastated room, noticing how the family portraits had been damaged by glass fragments, and how decades of family history were literally falling apart before his eyes, before responding with a voice loaded with despair and deep regret. He quickly explained that the attackers were probably connected to people he had crossed decades ago, enemies who had apparently waited patiently for an opportunity to repay old offenses, using the family as the target of their revenge. The gathering of the entire family at the mansion, including Hannah, whose existence they might have recently discovered, had created an irresistible opportunity for people who had waited decades for exactly this type of vulnerable moment. David immediately understood that his decision to confront William had inadvertently created the perfect situation for the family's enemies to attack when everyone was gathered in a predictable location. "They found us!" William shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a confession of guilt that had been postponed for decades. "After all these years thinking we were safe, they finally found us. And it's all my fault for believing that the past could remain buried forever." The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the corridors of the mansion, indicating that the attackers were not satisfied with simply breaking windows, but that they intended to enter the property to directly confront the family that had become the focus of their violent attention. David quickly evaluated their options, realizing that remaining in the main room would make them easy targets for anyone entering through the broken window, but that trying to move through the mansion's corridors could expose them to even greater dangers. Hannah pointed to a side door from the room that led to a service stairway that could offer a less obvious escape route, her familiarity with dangerous situations becoming evident in her ability to think strategically even under extreme pressure. Madison was holding Emma firmly, both girls clearly terrified, but trusting their father to keep them safe through a situation that was far beyond anything their young minds could have imagined. "David, you need to get the girls out of here now," William insisted, his voice revealing acceptance that his past actions had finally reached his family in a devastating way. "Take Hannah and the children away from this house, away from me before it's too late to escape the consequences of my past mistakes." David looked at the chaos around the elegant room that had transformed into a war zone, then at his daughters, who depended on him to navigate through dangers they had done nothing to deserve, and finally at William, whose face revealed decades of regret that were finally manifesting in real and terrifying consequences. He made a decision that he knew would change the course of their lives forever, a decision motivated by the immediate need to protect his family, but also by the understanding that the secrets and lies had become unsustainable and dangerous. The sounds of destruction continued echoing through the mansion, constantly reminding them that every second of hesitation increased the danger for everyone present, especially for the children who had become innocent targets of vengeance that preceded their births. "William, I will protect my family, but when this is all over, you will tell me the whole truth about everything," declared David, beginning to move toward the side door that Hannah had indicated. "I will find out exactly who these people are, what they want, and how to ensure my family is never again threatened by secrets from the past that we had no part in creating." Hannah moved quickly to help Madison and Emma head toward the escape door, her experience with dangerous situations allowing her to assume a leadership role in evacuating the devastated room. David took a last look at the wreckage of the main room, noting how the photographs that had revealed the truth about Hannah were now scattered among the shards of glass like fragmented evidence of a family history that had become literally explosive. William remained near the table, as if prepared to face the attackers alone in an attempt to protect the family through personal sacrifice. But David knew that fleeing was the only option that offered any chance of keeping everyone alive. The mansion's corridors echoed with sounds suggesting that the attackers were systematically approaching the main room, making each second of delay potentially fatal for everyone present. "Hannah, do you know any safe place where we can hide until this passes?" asked David while guiding his daughters through the side door. "Because now that I know you're really part of our family, I won't let anything happen to you either." Hannah hesitated for a moment, looking back at William, who remained in the devastated room like a tragic figure, accepting the consequences of decisions made decades ago, before nodding and indicating that she knew places where they could find information that would help them fully understand the situation they were in. She quickly mentioned that there were documents and records in other locations that could reveal specific identities of the family's enemies, information that William had hidden but that would now become essential to ensure everyone's safety. David understood that his search for truths had transformed into a matter of survival, and that protecting his family now would require not only escaping the immediate danger, but also discovering enough information to ensure they would never again be vulnerable targets. William had documents kept at the hospital where Hannah and Sarah were born, revealed Hannah as they moved through the mansion's dark corridors. If we can get there and find those records, we can discover exactly who our enemies are and how to permanently protect ourselves from them. The abandoned hospital rose against the night sky like a forgotten monument to human suffering, its broken windows resembling empty eyes that had witnessed decades of births, deaths, and secrets now buried among debris and dusty documents. David parked his car at a safe distance from the main building, having left Madison and Emma with a trusted neighbor, after explaining that he needed to investigate some urgent family matters that couldn't wait until dawn. The night wind blew through the damaged structures of the hospital, creating ghostly sounds that echoed through the empty corridors like the laments of long-forgotten patients. He carried a powerful flashlight and a crowbar he had found in the trunk, tools he hoped would be sufficient to access the archives Hannah had mentioned before disappearing in the chaos of the attack on William's mansion. "If the answers are here, I'll find them tonight," he muttered to himself, looking at the dark windows of the building. "My family deserves to know the complete truth, no matter how disturbing it may be." The main entrance of the hospital was sealed with wooden boards that had rotted over the years, but David found a side entrance where time and elements had created an opening sufficient to allow access to the interior of the abandoned building. His footsteps echoed through the dusty corridors while the flashlight revealed peeling walls, rusted medical equipment, and piles of papers that had been left to deteriorate when the hospital was closed decades ago. The air inside the building was heavy with the smell of mold and degradation, but David persisted in his exploration, driven by the determination to discover documents that could explain not only the birth of the twins, but also the secrets that had surrounded their lives from the first day. Identification signs still hung crookedly on the walls, indicating different departments and rooms that had once been the center of intense medical activity, but now served only as landmarks in his search for buried truths. Hannah said the records would be in the maternity ward, David remembered, consulting his memory about the instructions she had whispered during their escape from the mansion. If William really hid documents here, they must be where the twins were born. David navigated the labyrinthine corridors, following faded signs pointing to the maternity ward, his flashlight creating dancing shadows that seemed to take on a life of their own as he moved through the ghostly hospital. When he finally reached the correct section of the building, he discovered that many of the doors were open or had been forced by vandals over the years, revealing rooms that still contained rusted cribs and medical equipment covered by decades of dust and abandonment. The sound of his footsteps seemed louder in this section of the hospital, echoing differently through spaces that had been designed to accommodate the first moments of life rather than the last breaths of dying buildings. He examined several rooms before finding what appeared to be the main maternity archive, a smaller room where rusted metal files still contained documents that had miraculously survived decades of neglect and natural deterioration. "This must be the place," thought David, observing the rows of drawers that extended from floor to ceiling. 34 years ago, Sarah and Hannah were born here, and somewhere in these archives is the evidence of what really happened. The archive drawers initially resisted David's efforts to open them, their rusty locks protesting against decades of disuse, until he managed to force them with the crowbar he had brought specifically for this eventuality. Yellowed and fragile documents filled each drawer in approximate chronological order, records of births, deaths, and patient transfers that told silent stories of lives that had passed through those rooms during the hospital's years of operation. David methodically searched through the records, specifically looking for documents from the year Sarah and Hannah were born, his fingers moving carefully through papers that fell apart at the slightest touch. The work was tedious, and the flashlight created shadows that made reading difficult. But his determination to find answers kept him focused, even when the oppressive environment of the abandoned hospital began to affect his nerves. "Here it is," he said aloud when he finally found a section of documents from the correct year. Birth records from 34 years ago, exactly when Sarah and Hannah came into the world. The first documents David examined seemed routine, standard records of births that had occurred at the hospital during that specific period, but as he continued his investigation, he began to notice subtle inconsistencies, suggesting that not all records were completely legitimate. There were gaps in the sequential numbering of documents, spaces where records should exist, but had apparently been removed or never properly created. When he finally found the documents related to the twins' birth, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. There were 2 birth records for the same day, same time, same mother, but only one had been officially filed with the proper authorities. The second record, hidden among other documents and marked with handwritten notes suggesting it should remain confidential, documented the birth of a second child who had been transferred to special care without additional specification about the baby's final destination. 2 babies were born on the same day, David muttered, comparing the documents under the flashlight. But only Sarah was officially registered, while Hannah was erased from the records as if she had never existed. As David continued examining the documents, he discovered additional evidence of tampering that painted a clear picture of a deliberate conspiracy to hide the existence of one of the twins. There were medical forms that had been altered, with information about weight and measurements of 2 babies being condensed into a single record, and marginal notes in handwriting he didn't recognize, but which clearly indicated specific instructions on how to keep one of the children completely out of official records. The evidence suggested that the concealment process had been planned in advance, not a last-minute decision made in the heat of the moment, but a carefully orchestrated operation that involved multiple people within the hospital. David felt growing anger as he realized that Sarah had been deprived of her sister from birth by a conspiracy that involved not only William, but also medical professionals who should have prioritized the children's welfare above any political or financial consideration. Sarah never had a chance to know her sister because adults conspired to separate them before they could even form memories of each other, thought David, his indignation growing with each document he examined. Hannah was erased from official existence as if she were just a problem to be solved. The sound of footsteps echoing through the distant corridors of the hospital made David freeze instantly, his attention shifting from the documents to focus completely on the noises, suggesting he was no longer alone in the abandoned building. He quickly turned off the flashlight and crouched behind the metal filing cabinets, trying to determine the direction and proximity of the sounds that clearly indicated someone was moving through the hospital with specific purpose. The footsteps were cautious but determined, suggesting familiarity with the building's layout that could indicate the visitor had been there before, possibly for the same investigative purposes that had brought David to that location. He held the most revealing documents against his chest, aware that they represented crucial evidence that could not be lost regardless of who else might be exploring the abandoned hospital. "Someone else is here," he whispered to himself, trying to control his breathing to avoid making any sound that might reveal his location. "It could be Hannah. It could be someone looking for the same documents I found, or it could be someone far more dangerous." The footsteps gradually approached the maternity ward, and David could hear the sound of doors being opened and closed as the mysterious visitor systematically examined different rooms in the hospital. When the person finally reached the corridor that led directly to the file room where David was hidden, he immediately recognized the pattern of breathing and movement that identified the visitor as Hannah. She was clearly out of breath, as if she had run a considerable distance to reach the hospital, and her movements revealed urgency mixed with hesitation, as if she were internally struggling about whether she should proceed with whatever had brought her to that location. David considered revealing his presence immediately, but decided to remain hidden for a few moments to observe Hannah's actions and try to understand her motivations for being at the hospital. "Hannah is here," thought David, watching through a gap between the filing cabinets as she entered the room. "But she seems desperate, as if she were trying to get here before me to prevent me from discovering something specific." Hannah entered the archives room with frantic movements, her eyes immediately fixing on the open drawers and scattered documents that clearly revealed someone had been rummaging through the old medical records. Her expression revealed a mixture of panic and desperation when she realized her arrival had been too late to prevent the secrets buried in the archives from being discovered. She moved quickly toward the open drawers, clearly looking for specific documents that she hoped to hide or destroy before they caused more complications for a situation that had already become dangerously complex. David observed as she examined the files with a familiarity that suggested prior knowledge about the content and location of specific documents, confirming his suspicions that Hannah knew much more about the family's secrets than she had revealed until that moment. "David, I know you're here," Hannah said with a voice that trembled between exhaustion and desperation. "Please come out from where you're hiding, because we need to talk before you find things you'll regret discovering." David slowly emerged from his position behind the file cabinets, keeping the revealing documents firmly in his hands while observing Hannah with a mixture of suspicion and concern for the clearly agitated condition she was in. Her clothes were disheveled, and she had small cuts on her hands that suggested she had encountered significant difficulties in reaching the hospital, possibly including the need to force her entry through physical barriers protecting the abandoned building. Her eyes were red from tears, and her face revealed an exhaustion that went far beyond physical tiredness, suggesting she had been struggling with intense emotional conflicts since her separation from the group during the attack on William's mansion. David could see that she was trembling slightly, not just from the night cold that permeated the unheated hospital, but also from the emotional tension of a situation that had clearly become much more complex than any of them had anticipated. "Hannah, how did you get here?" asked David, keeping his voice low but firm. "And why do you seem so desperate to prevent me from discovering the truth about your and Sarah's birth?" Hannah approached David with hesitant steps, her hands extended in a pleading gesture that revealed her desperate need to convince him to stop his investigation before he discovered information that she clearly considered dangerous or devastating. When she spoke, her voice was loaded with emotion that had been repressed for a long time, and David could see fresh tears beginning to form in her eyes as she struggled to find adequate words for the impossible situation they found themselves in. She explained that she had escaped from the chaos at William's mansion and immediately understood that David would try to follow the clues she had mentioned about documents hidden in the hospital, leading her to run through the city in hopes of arriving before him to protect him from truths that could be more painful than Sarah's death itself. Her movements were agitated, and her eyes constantly diverted from the documents in David's hands, as if she could make the evidence disappear simply by avoiding looking directly at them. "David, please stop searching," Hannah implored, her words coming out in a desperate flow of emotion. "There are things in these archives that will completely destroy the memory you have of Sarah, and some truths are too heavy to be carried by people who have already suffered devastating losses." David retreated slightly, keeping the documents out of Hannah's reach, while studying her desperate expression and trying to understand exactly what kind of information could be so devastating that she would risk her own safety to prevent him from discovering it. He had found clear evidence that the twins' birth had been deliberately obscured through falsification of documents, but Hannah's extreme reaction suggested that there were additional layers of truth that were even more disturbing than the simple concealment of the existence of a twin sister. The environment of the abandoned hospital seemed to be becoming more oppressive with each passing moment, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the emotional tension that grew between David and Hannah as they approached revelations that would fundamentally change their understanding of everything they thought they knew about their family history. "Hannah, I've already found evidence that both of you were born here, but only Sarah was officially registered," said David, his voice revealing growing determination. "Now I want you to tell me exactly what else is hidden in these documents that makes you so terrified about the possibility of me finding out." Hannah stopped moving toward David and remained motionless for a long moment, as if she were waging an internal battle about how much of the truth she could or should reveal to protect Sarah's memory and David's emotional well-being. When she finally began to speak, it was with a low, controlled voice that revealed years of practice in hiding painful truths, but also with a trembling quality that suggested she was finally reaching the limits of her ability to keep secrets that had defined her entire life. She explained that the documents David had found were just the surface of a much deeper and more complex conspiracy that involved not only the separation of the twins, but also circumstances related to Sarah's death that were not as David had been led to believe. The hospital around them seemed to be whispering with echoes of ancient secrets, as Hannah prepared to reveal information that would completely destroy the narrative that David had built about the life and death of his beloved wife. "David, what I'm going to tell you will change everything you think you know about Sarah," said Hannah, tears now flowing freely down her face. "But you need to understand that she made choices to protect you and the girls, even if those choices cost her own life." The mention that Sarah's death had not been as David believed made his world begin to crumble again, forcing him to lean against the metal files to maintain his balance as he processed the devastating implications of what Hannah was suggesting. He had spent months fighting against the pain of the natural loss of his wife to illness, gradually building an acceptance of death as an inevitable part of life, only to discover now that his fundamental understanding of the events that had destroyed his family might have been based on carefully constructed lies. The documents in his hands seemed to burn with the intensity of the truths they contained, and he looked at Hannah with a mixture of terror and determination that revealed his desperate need to finally fully understand the events that had shaped his life. "Hannah, what are you saying about Sarah's death?" asked David, his voice revealing a forced calmness that masked the emotional turmoil he was experiencing. "If there's something about my wife's death that I don't know, something that was hidden from me, then you're going to tell me now, because I deserve to know how she really died." Hannah closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if preparing to cross a line that she knew could not be uncrossed once the words were spoken. When she opened her eyes again, they were filled with tears and a depth of sadness that revealed years of guilt and regret for having participated, even unwillingly, in the construction of lies that had protected David from the complete truth about the circumstances of Sarah's death. She approached David slowly, as if approaching an injured animal that might react unpredictably when confronted with traumatic information, and when she finally spoke, it was with a voice that carried the weight of secrets that had been too heavy for one person to carry alone. "David, your wife didn't die as you think," revealed Hannah, each word coming out as if it were being physically torn from her throat. "The disease that you thought took her was real, but the way she died, the final circumstances, were very different from what you were led to believe by the doctors and by William." Hannah's revelation echoed through the dusty archive room like an emotional thunder, making David feel as if all the air had been sucked from his lungs as he tried to process the magnitude of what was being suggested about his beloved wife's death. He leaned more heavily against the files, feeling his legs weaken as he understood that his pain and grief of the past months had been based on an edited version of reality that had been carefully constructed to protect him from an even more devastating truth. The documents in his hands seemed to be shaking, though he realized it was his own hand that was trembling uncontrollably, as he faced the possibility that everything he thought he knew about Sarah's final moments had been an elaborate fabrication. "Hannah, you need to tell me exactly what happened to Sarah," David demanded, his voice growing in intensity despite the intimate environment of the abandoned room. "If she didn't die the way they told me, if there were circumstances that were hidden from me, then I need to know every detail, because I've lived with this pain based on a lie." Hannah looked around the abandoned room, as if searching for invisible forces that could help her find the right words for a revelation she knew would change David's life forever, before making a decision she had clearly been avoiding for a long time. When she spoke again, it was with a voice that had found a firm resolution despite the tears that continued to fall, as if she had finally decided that carrying secrets alone had become more dangerous than sharing painful truths with the person who most deserved to know them. She explained that there was information and people who needed to be present for the complete truth about Sarah to be properly revealed. Truths that involved not only the circumstances of her death, but also decisions she had made in her final moments to protect her family from dangers that might still be present. "David, I can't tell you everything here in this place haunted by medical ghosts," said Hannah, her voice gaining strength as she made a decision she had been avoiding. "If you really want the complete truth about Sarah, about her death, about why she made the choices she made, then meet me at the old church tomorrow at sunset." David looked at Hannah with growing frustration, realizing that even in this moment of partial revelation, she was still trying to control the flow of information and protect him from truths he felt he had the right to know immediately. The abandoned hospital around them seemed to be echoing with all the secrets that had been buried within its walls over the years, and David felt that adding more mysteries to the already complex situation would be intolerable for his emotional sanity. He understood, however, that Hannah was clearly talking about revelations that involved other people who would need to be present to provide a complete picture of the truth, and that forcing her to reveal partial information at that moment could result in more confusion than clarity. "Why the church?" asked David, his voice revealing both exhaustion and determination. "Hannah, what is this place where I will finally discover the whole truth about my wife, and who else needs to be there to tell me what really happened to Sarah?" Hannah wiped the tears from her face with the backs of her hands, leaving clean trails through the dust that had accumulated on her skin during her desperate journey across the city to reach the hospital before David. When she responded, it was with a voice that had found a strange calm, as if finally making the decision to reveal all truths had removed a weight she had carried for a long time. She explained that the old church was a place where all family secrets could finally be exposed, in the presence of all the people who had participated in the decisions that shaped Sarah and Hannah's lives, including some that David had never met, but who had profoundly influenced his family's fate. "If you want the complete truth, meet me at the old church," Hannah said in a low voice, almost whispering. "There everyone will have to speak, and you will finally know not only how Sarah died, but why she chose to die the way she died." The abandoned church rose against the twilight sky like a cathedral of forgotten secrets, its broken stained glass allowing golden rays of sunlight to penetrate through the colored cracks and create mystical patterns on the stone floor worn by decades of abandonment and deterioration. David firmly held Madison and Emma's hands as they walked through the rusty iron gate that protected the sacred ground, their steps echoing against the irregular stones that formed the path to the main entrance of the church that had witnessed decades of prayers, confessions, and secrets that were now about to be revealed under extraordinary circumstances. The church towers extended toward the sky like supplicating fingers, and David could feel the spiritual weight of the place pressing against his chest as he approached the answers he had desperately sought since the moment he saw Hannah in the elegant restaurant. "Daddy, this place seems haunted by ghosts of people who came here seeking forgiveness," whispered Madison, her eyes carefully observing the shadows dancing between the ancient pillars. "Will we finally discover the whole truth about Mom, or just find more mysteries that will leave us even more confused?" The interior of the church revealed an atmosphere of sacred decay that seemed perfectly appropriate for revelations that had been kept for too long, with worn wooden pews aligned in rows that led the eye directly to a cracked altar where lit candles created circles of golden light against the growing darkness of the night. David immediately noticed that Hannah was already present, her familiar silhouette kneeling before the altar, as if seeking spiritual strength to face confessions that she knew would change lives forever. Beside her, William's hunched figure seemed smaller and more fragile than David had ever seen, as if the weight of decades of secrets was finally taking its physical and emotional toll in a visible and devastating way. The candles flickered with each breeze that entered through the broken stained glass windows, creating dancing shadows that seemed to be whispering their own secrets on the stone walls that had absorbed decades of confessions and regrets. "Hannah, William, we've arrived as promised," declared David, his voice echoing through the sacred space with authority that demanded complete answers. "Now I want you to tell me the whole truth about Sarah, about her death, and about why my family was involved in secrets that nearly cost us our lives." Hannah rose slowly from the altar, her tears glistening in the candlelight as she turned to face David with an expression that mixed relief at finally being able to reveal long-buried truths with terror at the consequences these revelations might have on a family that had already suffered devastating losses. William remained hunched before the altar, as if seeking divine forgiveness for decisions he had made decades ago and that were now about to be exposed in all their painful complexity. David guided his daughters to a nearby pew, instructing them to remain quiet while the adults discussed important family matters, but he could see in Madison's eyes that she was determined to hear every word of the conversation that would finally explain the mysteries that had dominated their lives. The candles continued their hypnotic dances, creating an atmosphere that seemed simultaneously comforting and ominous, as if the sacred space itself was preparing to witness revelations that would test the limits of human understanding about love, sacrifice, and family betrayal. David, what I'm going to tell you will completely destroy the peace you've managed to build after Sarah's death, warned Hannah, her trembling voice echoing among the ancient pillars. But you have the right to know that your wife died as a heroine, protecting you and the girls from dangers you didn't even know existed. William finally rose from the altar, his movements revealing a fragility that dramatically contrasted with the authoritative figure David had known throughout all the years of marriage to Sarah. And when he turned to face his son-in-law, his eyes were red from tears that seemed to have been held back for entire decades. His hands visibly trembled as he approached the group, each step seeming to require tremendous effort from a man who had carried the weight of impossible decisions for too long. David observed with a mixture of anger and compassion as William struggled to find adequate words for confessions that he knew would fundamentally change how his family viewed him and understood their shared history. The shadows of the church seemed to be closing around the small group, creating an intimate circle of candlelight that separated their revelations from the outside world and created a sacred space where painful truths could finally find their voice. David, I made decisions that seemed right at the time, but that I now understand caused unnecessary suffering to innocent people, confessed William, his hoarse voice revealing decades of repressed guilt. When I gave Hannah away as a baby to another family, I truly believed I was saving Sarah and protecting our family from enemies who would not hesitate to use innocent children as instruments of pressure and revenge. William's confession about his motivations for separating the twins created an emotionally charged pause in the silent church, and David felt a complex mixture of understanding and anger as he processed the information that the decisions that had shaped his family's life had been made with protective intentions, even if the consequences had been devastating for all the people involved. Hannah approached William with hesitant steps, as if seeing her biological father with a new perspective after decades of questioning why she had been abandoned by the family that should have protected her. Madison and Emma silently observed from the bench where David had instructed them to remain, but he could see that both were absorbing every word of the conversation that was painting a completely new portrait of their family history. The candles flickered more intensely, as if even the flames were reacting to the emotional intensity of the confessions being shared in the sacred space. William, I can understand your motivations for separating the twins when they were babies, said David, his voice controlled but loaded with growing emotion. But Hannah told me that Sarah's death wasn't how I thought it was, that there were circumstances that were hidden from me, and now I need to know exactly what happened to my wife in her final moments. William and Hannah exchanged glances loaded with meaning, as if they were silently communicating about who should reveal the most painful part of the truth that had brought everyone to this abandoned church in search of answers that would fundamentally change everything. Hannah nodded almost imperceptibly, as if giving permission for William to continue with revelations that she knew would be devastating for David, but that were necessary for him to fully understand the sacrifices Sarah had made to protect her family. The atmosphere of the church seemed to be becoming heavier with each passing moment, as if the stones themselves were absorbing the emotional weight of the confessions being prepared. David, Sarah discovered Hannah's existence about a year before her death, revealed William, his words falling like stones in a tranquil lake. When she learned she had a twin sister who had been hidden for decades, she began asking questions, searching for answers, and this quest for truth caught the attention of dangerous people who I thought had completely forgotten about our family. The revelation that Sarah had discovered Hannah a year before her death made David's world dangerously shake, forcing him to completely rethink the last year of his wife's life and question every conversation, every silent moment, every distant look that now gained new meaning in light of the information being revealed. He remembered occasions when Sarah had seemed worried or distant, moments he had attributed to stress or tiredness, but which he now understood could have been signs that she was struggling with devastating discoveries about her own family history. Hannah carefully observed David's expression, clearly anticipating the emotional impact the revelations were having on a man who had built his understanding of his marriage to Sarah based on an incomplete version of reality. Sarah knew about me during the last year of her life, asked David, his voice revealing a mixture of betrayal and sadness. She was carrying this immense secret struggling with these discoveries alone, and I didn't even realize my own wife was going through a devastating emotional crisis right in front of me. William continued his painful confession, explaining how Sarah had initially been furious upon discovering Hannah's existence, but had gradually understood her father's motivations and had even begun looking for ways to make safe contact with her lost sister without putting anyone in danger. Unfortunately, her investigations had caught the attention of old enemies who still maintained interest in the family, and when Sarah refused to stop her search for Hannah, her life had been directly threatened by people who saw any reunification of the twins as a threat to their own obscure interests. Hannah moved closer to David, her tears falling freely as she prepared to reveal the most devastating part of the truth about Sarah's final moments. "David, your wife didn't die just from the disease that was consuming her," said Hannah, her voice breaking with emotion. "In her final days, when she was at her weakest and most vulnerable, dangerous people were involved in her death, ensuring that she couldn't reveal important secrets they wanted to keep buried forever." The revelation that Sarah had been murdered by people who wanted to keep family secrets buried hit David like a devastating lightning bolt, causing him to double over in emotional pain as he understood that his wife had been the victim of a conspiracy that included not only her separation from her twin sister, but also her elimination when she became a threat to people who preferred certain truths to remain hidden. Madison and Emma, who had been trying to discreetly listen to the adults' conversation, could no longer contain their emotional reactions and began crying as they understood that their mother had been killed by evil people instead of having died naturally from the disease everyone thought had taken her life. Hannah immediately moved to comfort the girls, her own pain being amplified by seeing the nieces she barely knew suffering from revelations that were devastating even for experienced adults. "My Sarah was murdered," whispered David, his voice broken by the realization that his pain over the past few months had been based on a carefully constructed lie. "She died because she was trying to find Hannah, because she wanted to reunite our family, and I didn't even know my wife was in mortal danger right in front of me." Hannah hugged Madison and Emma firmly, trying to offer comfort to children who were discovering that their understanding of their mother's death had been fundamentally incorrect, while her own eyes filled with tears as she realized how her family's secrets had cost the life of the sister she never had the opportunity to properly know. William remained near the altar, as if seeking divine forgiveness for decisions that had resulted in the death of his own daughter, his tears falling on the ancient stones as he faced the devastating consequences of choices made decades ago with protective intentions. David struggled to process the magnitude of the betrayal that had been perpetrated not only against Sarah, but against his entire family, understanding that they had lived months of mourning based on a false narrative that protected the true people responsible for the destruction of their lives. "Hannah, do you know the people who killed Sarah?" asked David, his voice growing in intensity as his pain transformed into directed anger. "If we know who did this, if we can identify my wife's murderers, then we can seek justice instead of simply accepting this tragedy as something inevitable." Hannah gently moved away from the girls and faced David with an expression that revealed both fear and determination, explaining that the people responsible for Sarah's death were powerful and dangerous, connected to organizations that operated outside the bounds of normal law and who had demonstrated willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened their interests through inconvenient discoveries about the past. William finally found strength to join the conversation again, admitting that he had spent decades trying to protect his family by keeping them ignorant about enemies who had never really forgotten or forgiven offenses of the past. The church candles continued their hypnotic dances, creating shadows that seemed to be whispering about justice and vengeance as the family struggled to understand how to proceed with knowledge that was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. "David, the people who killed Sarah are still dangerous," warned Hannah, her voice loaded with genuine concern for her niece's safety. "Seeking justice through normal channels could expose you and the girls to risks that Sarah died trying to avoid, and I cannot allow her sacrifice to be wasted by putting you in additional danger." William approached David with faltering steps, extending a trembling hand as if begging for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. David looked at his father-in-law with a mixture of anger and compassion, understanding that William carried devastating guilt for decades, but struggling to forgive decisions that cost Sarah's life. "David, I have carried this guilt for decades, knowing that my decisions cost my own daughter's life," confessed William, his voice broken by regret. "I tried to protect Sarah by keeping Hannah hidden, but when she discovered the truth, I couldn't protect her from the consequences of my own cowardice." The silence was broken only by the night wind through the broken stained glass, creating a ghostly melody that carried tears and regrets of generations. David looked at his daughters, clinging to each other as they processed revelations that transformed their understanding about their mother's death. "Now we know the whole truth about Sarah, about Hannah, about the secrets that almost killed us," said David, his voice echoing with determination. "But what do we do now with this truth? How do we protect our family, and how do we honor the sacrifice Sarah made?" It was at this moment that an impossible sound echoed through the church, causing everyone to freeze instantly. A female voice, identical to Sarah's, called his name through the shadows with a familiarity that made his heart stop. "David," the voice echoed from the back of the church, where the shadows were deepest. Everyone turned simultaneously, their expressions revealing terror, hope, and complete confusion as they tried to comprehend whether they were hearing a supernatural apparition, an impossible survivor, or the beginning of an even more complex new mystery. If David's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment where you're from. And don't go anywhere. The next story is already appearing on the screen, made especially for you. See you soon.